My name is Corey Cook. I'm a professor at USF. I direct a Center for Public Service. I was asked to talk about sort of the history of social movements and sort of how those movements have helped create a diverse, equitable, creative, interesting city. I remember the first time I came to San Francisco, not as a child, right? When the first time you get off the BART by yourself, and you come into Civic Center and you're like, wow, I'm somewhere like strangely different and yet home at the same time, right? And that's what that history of movements in San Francisco has been, right? And we can point to our favorite movements, whether it was the movement to stop to block the freeways that were being constructed, or whether it was the movements to prevent evictions in Manila Town at the I Hotel, whether it was the student movements, the student protest movements at City College and SF State around ethnic studies, whether the movements, anti-war movements, women's movements, gay liberation movements, movements to deal with people living with AIDS. You know, it's a city of movements, and that's created a diverse, equitable, creative city. Now, to be fair to the history, not all of our movements have been in that vein, right? We've also had movements that were based on exclusion, like systematic exclusion of Chinese Americans, and designed to ensure that Chinese Americans couldn't attend the same schools as white San Franciscans, or that marginalized African Americans in San Francisco. So not all of our movements have been of this progressive kind. And not all of our movements have been sort of as neat as we would like to have remembered them, right? That oftentimes the protests themselves are not kind of like how we'd want to remember them. We often get times caught up in the tactics, right? What academics call the repertoires of collective action, right? Rather than the movements themselves. So we spend a lot of time debating. I debate with my colleagues and with other scholars, with practitioners about the Google bus protests and whether those are part of a social movement or not, or whether they're effective or not, or the Occupy movements. And they're effective insofar as they raise public awareness, they help shape the public discourse. But movements are truly effective when they get people to move beyond traditional interests, ideologies, and identities, right? And these movements, as repertoires of collective action, haven't been successful. But as markers that get us to think about income inequality, right? Alaska, Arkansas, Nebraska, South Dakota voted for minimum wage increases in the last election. Last I checked, those are pretty red states, like really deeply red states, right? In addition to Oakland and San Francisco, where it passed in San Francisco with almost 80% of the vote, right? A minimum wage increase in San Francisco, remarkable support to deal with income inequality. Cities around the country, not just San Francisco, right? Cities around the country are dealing with affordability. You know, Chicago, Seattle, Los Angeles, New York, Albuquerque, cities that are concerned about how do we create a more diverse, equitable, vibrant city. So, we get caught up oftentimes in debating the tactics, but the movements, I think, are what have shaped the city. I know we live at the center of the universe in San Francisco. I always feel bad. I think I'm going to lose my San Francisco card by suggesting that we don't. But what made these movements important is that they were connected to these movements around the world, right? That these were globally connected movements, much in the way that concern about income inequality today is, or that concern about affordability is. Our students came back on Monday, so students at USF came back. They're very much involved right now in immigrant rights movements, which you see protests around the country, focusing, in my view, on the wrong thing, right? The Obama plan, not how do we integrate effectively low-income immigrant populations in cities around the country in the economic, social, political life of their cities. We're instead debating whether deferred action is the right approach or not, or whether the president had authority to do it, but not how do we integrate immigrants who are going to be the future of San Francisco. And the degree to which depends on how well we integrate those communities economically, politically, socially, and culturally, right? Another movement our students are involved in is the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Some of you saw it maybe today or yesterday, Ben and Jerry's very publicly taking action. A lot of that is fueled by concerns with community-police relations in cities, but it's also about integration of low-income communities of color, particularly men and boys of color, in cities where they've been marginalized historically. A lot of the work that we do at the McCarthy Center, and I'm just going to talk about some of the things we've been involved in, and I want to say I very much appreciate the conversation about housing that's going on here. I think it's important that we build housing at all income levels. I think it's also important a lot of our work is around public housing, because we've created communities of concentrated poverty, of concentrated disadvantage, where African American in particular, boys and men, 20% of San Francisco children of color, but boys of color, African American boys, 20% live in public housing in San Francisco, right? You all know the black population in San Francisco has been declining precipitously. It's declined every year for the last 20 years and every decade for probably the last 6. We've created these concentrated poverty neighborhoods, which have particularly harmful effects for boys of color, marginalized in their schools, disproportionately unlikely to have high quality preschool, disproportionately unlikely to be prepared for kindergarten, disproportionately unlikely to be at the appropriate reading level and math level in 4th grade, disproportionately unlikely by 8th grade to have high GPAs and high enough math and reading scores. And that is the best predictor of college achievement. 8th grade GPAs and math and reading scores, not the SAT. Right? So we've already recreated intergenerational poverty in place in cities around the country. Again, this is not purely a San Francisco problem. It's a problem we're dealing with in Oakland, in Richmond, and around the country, right? But how do we reinvent our public housing? And a lot of that San Francisco is starting to do, right? And there's a lot of conversation about how we can reinvest in public housing when the federal government, again, is completely absent, isn't building any more public housing, isn't investing any more in public housing. So San Francisco's on its own to try to integrate boys and men of color who've been historically marginalized economically, educationally, socially, politically. How do you actually work to build community and build collective efficacy in these concentrated disadvantaged neighborhoods? A lot of the work we do is in the Western Addition. The Western Addition, as many of you know, there were 4 homicides in one night a few weeks back. The Western Addition is an historically vibrant neighborhood. It's one that's gentrifying rapidly. But pockets, deep pockets of concentrated intergenerational poverty. And the city and the school district and community organizations and institutions like the University of San Francisco and the center that I work in, the University of San Francisco, are to take, how do we develop systemic change? How do we share data between institutions? How do we share data between school districts and nonprofit organizations? There is not a single program that we can create. There's not a magic bullet. There's not something else in other jurisdictions doing that we can simply import. We have to find the political will to actually move beyond the traditional boundaries of city government, of school districts, of nonprofit organizations, of institutions like ours, and create collective action among us to have a positive impact. Deal simultaneously, these are the messy problems, right? This is what probably a lot of you deal with on a daily basis. The messy problems, the wicked problems, right? Dealing simultaneously at the same time on both men and boys of color, both intergenerationally, and simultaneously around health and education and wellness and mental health and special education and all the other indicators that are going on at the same time. We have to intervene consistently, effectively, across all those traditional barriers, at the same time help individual boys and men of color develop the resiliency to cope with the concentrated poverty that they're dealing with in these neighborhoods. So again, I think we've committed, the university's committed to a 20-year effort to work in the Western Addition, to work along with my good friend London Breed, and the mayor, the superintendent, to work to fix these systems, create wraparound services in public housing, particularly the public housing that's not being recreated by Hope SF, and try to create opportunities for people so that the future of San Francisco is one where these groups are not marginalized, are not economically marginalized, not politically marginalized, not socially marginalized, to take the energy of these social movements and channel them into positive social change. So, thank you very much.